So this is our final lecture on the beginning of World War II, as we're kind of focusing in on the beginning of the actual conflict itself. So we left off the last lecture with the Phoney War, the kind of period after the invasion of Poland, where it seems like you have France and Britain going and signing up to fight against Germany, but Germany reorganizing and reoriented itself to attack from there. In May of 1940, Germany is going to attack France outright. Hitler sent tanks through the Ardennes forest to bypass the French defensive line, which they called the Maginot Line. You'll see this a lot in military history, where the generals of a new in a new war are going to try to learn the lessons and are still trying to use the tactics of the old war. The French do not do what the Germans did when looking back at World War I, where the Germans see that the strength is going to lie in movement and in quickness and speed and mechanization. The French say the next World War is going to be the next war with Germany is going to be a replay of World War I. So we need increased fortifications. We need to dig deeper into the ground, and they create these big, huge, giant, pretty impressive systems of linked forts along the French-German border, called the Maginot Line, which the Germans just bypass right around by going through the what supposedly thickly unpassable Ardennes forest and catch the French in their defenses right from there. It takes only 40 days to do what the German army in World War I took 4 years to try, and that's not France out. By the end of June, France is gone and is forced to surrender. 400,000, though, British and French troops were trapped at the English Channel port city of Dunkirk. And as they're kind of trapped and running out of time, and the German tanks begin to squeeze on them, the British organize what's called Operation Domino, where they grab a makeshift fleet of any available boat was then sent across the English Channel to pick up 330,000 of the remaining British and French soldiers. And this is pretty important because this is going to allow the British Army to survive. Again, they're trapped there at Dunkirk. It looks like it's pretty bleak when again through this having commandeering any large boat that they can get a hold of, and they sent this kind of makeshift fleet out in order to pick them any up. At this point, right before France surrenders, that Italy enters the war on the German side. It invades into southern France. The French army beats them back, and it stopped beating the Italians when the Germans forced them to sign the treaties to surrender. Dunkirk's important because being able to save the British army allows it to keep fighting and allows it to be able to pick up and move wherever they want them in future engagements, and it keeps the British still within there. On June 22nd of 1940 is officially when France surrenders. Germany is going to occupy the north of France, and a puppet Vichy government is established in southern France in the town of Vichy, France, ostensibly a kind of its own unique government, but basically the Germans run it, and the Vichy French government has to do what the Germans tell them to do. So that's what it is. So in May of 1940, Blitzkrieg is unleashed in the West on the French. And again, just like how we saw with the Poles, they really have no way of stopping and kind of figuring out this new way of attack. This is still, as much as the emphasis is on tanks and mechanization and trucks, there's still a lot of walking and running, and horses still involved from this. But again, the use of mechanized assaults from the land and the air really give the Germans advantage. They then begin to catch the British army that's landed to help the French out, and they're begin to push back and forced into the town of Dunkirk, which is across the English Channel from there. The Germans begin to squeeze this pocket of resistance tighter and tighter and tighter as it gets closer and closer and closer, and it looks like the pretty much the whole British army is going to be gobbled up and captured from there. And then, for whatever reason, the German tanks stop. They rest, they refit and refuel, and this is again one of the great what ifs and whys in World War II and 20th century history. Because if the Germans really press forward the attack here and keep everything going, the British are sitting ducks on the beaches, and it's pretty interesting. A couple historians recently have come out and said that one of the reasons that the German forces might have stopped is they ran out of drugs. The German army and the German forces had been kind of being prescribed from the army kind of rudimentary methamphetamines, which allowed them to fight days and days and days and days and days. But if you're on like 40 days of fighting on meth, eventually your body's going to come crashing down. And so they think they might, there's some speculation that they couldn't supply the German soldiers with enough drugs and other stuff in order to be able to reinforce and drive home the attacks. And they had to let them kind of refuel their bodies along with refueling the tanks and the other supply lines. So that's one theory. Again, it's just one of the great again question marks of world history. If you've seen the movie Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan does a pretty good job of taking historical footage and pictures from there and showing the amount of troops that are there. The movie Atonement also is a pretty good, like pretty long, continuous shot of the beaches at Dunkirk as well. From there, as the soldiers there are waiting any sort of transportation or be able to pick them up from there. And what did the Germans find? They found 70,000 soldiers to capture, but a lot of guns and tanks and helmets and other stuff to pick up from there. And we'll watch a short little clip of footage from Dunkirk.
Kirk, day and night the transports are steaming, and as one convoy returns, another is going over to take its place. The BEF is grateful too to its French comrades. Aboard the transport, the men are packed like sardines. But what does it matter? The tighter they're packed, the more they hold each other up. The BEF is grateful to the girls in uniform who stayed with them till the end. This is the most magnificent sight of a generation. This is the army under its magnificent leaders. They have come back from a terrible and bitter battle, but still in their tired and half-closed eyes is mirrored the spirit and cause for which they fight.
So again, just a little bit of footage from the battle. Again, Mussolini towards the end of June is also going to invade into France, but again, you can kind of see from the cartoon that it's just really just hitching its ride to the German war machine as it's going. The Nazis then, for the second time in 50 years, the Germans are marching through Paris. Hitler is going to visit Paris for the only time in his life, planning on coming back, but again, the war and other things come from there. So after defeating the French, the Germans turned towards Britain. In the summer of 1940, the Germans began planning for Operation Sea Lion. This is where Germany is going to begin to assemble a massive invasion force to be able to go across the English Channel and invade into Great Britain. In order to be able to do that, though, the Germans have to be able to get rid of the British fleet that would ostensibly protect the British uh, coastline. In order to be able to defeat the British fleet, the Germans need air superiority. So what Hitler decides is he's going to launch a massive bombing campaign against Great Britain, right? Be able to defeat all of their planes in the ground and in the sky, and then having air superiority will then allow for the German Navy to steam across the British Channel with the German Air Force providing cover for them, which would then allow for a successful invasion of Great Britain. So that the logic's there from there. So in the beginning of August of 1940, over 2,000 planes are sent to attack to begin the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe, or the Germans' Air Force, is goals to gain total control of the air by destroying the RAF, or the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, and that's the plan here. The beginning of the Battle of Britain starts with the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, attacking the airfields by bombing the runways and trying to attack the logistical ability of the planes to fly from there. And actually, if you look at the numbers, this is a pretty um, a pretty good idea, and also that it was actually working out in the favor of the Germans. Again, another great what if is what if the Germans kept on with their original plan, soaking up the massive amount of losses that they're doing, but also gaining by destroying the ability of the British to do that. Eventually, with some attacks by the British on the Germans themselves back in Germany, the decision is made to switch from attacking the airfields of the Royal Air Force to terror bombing the cities in what's called the London Blitz. And that switch from attacking the airfields to the cities is a tactical mistake by the Germans, and that allows the British to slowly gain the upper hand. The British also are using new technology, including radar, to be able to send radio waves out into the air and have them bounce back when they hit German planes, and that allows the British to get a heads up and also be able to direct fighters to shoot down German planes and German bombers for there. So this is what's referred to as the Battle of Britain. For over 6 weeks, the Royal Air Force is able to hold off the German Air Force over the skies of the English Channel and the Great Britain. It helps to be able to push off any chance for a German invasion, which they're not able to do. Hitler calls off the invasion for the summer of 1940. The bombing campaign continues, but it's going to slowly lessen over time. Winston Churchill is going to make a very famous speech where he says, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few," talking about the members of the Royal Air Force who went up in the planes for there. And they're going to be referred to as the few for the rest of their lives, as they're the ones who were up there. So again, these are German fighter planes going over the skies of Britain in order to be able to have the scoring the German bombers there drop all sorts of bombs over the skies of London in most of the cities. And again, starting off with the airfields of Britain as they're flying over and dropping stuff and dropping bombs from there. Again, you know it's Britain because again you can see the soccer stadiums from the skies. If you see that Big Ben there, you see all the different contrails of the planes flying over and the fighter planes and the bombers that are going on there as the British people learn to live in a new situation where they have bombs like these that didn't go off. You can see the size next to some school children. They imagine all the explosive power of this. These kids are pointing to their bedroom where they would have been if they and what had happened to them if that bomb exploded. And again, some famous things highlighting this picture right here. You can see just how big some of these bombs are with a uh, British double-decker bus, right, being swallowed up by them. That's famous St. Paul's Cathedral in England. From there, that survived the bombing. You can see down in this picture. This is from the top of St. Paul's. You can see all of the destruction being wrought from there. Again, affecting school children. Dogs were used to help to sniff out people within the rubble. And then famously, uh, British citizens would go down into the subways and other bomb shelters in order to be able to protect themselves from there as they tried to carry out their day-to-day lives as best they could. Uh, to be able to protect the island. Again, we have the radar system put in place, and you can kind of see the extent of radar coverage, allowing the British to be able to anticipate when the Germans were coming to allow them to send up their pilots in order to be able to meet them. And watch a short clip from a propaganda movie laid later on in the war that highlights a little bit of what the pilots went through.
Plan called for the RAF to be knocked out of the air. But the men of the RAF hadn't read the Nazi plan. In the first 4 days, the RAF knocked 182 German planes out of the sky. For the next week, the Germans attacked the coast cities from the Thames River to Weymouth.
Jenny, take cover.
And Hitler paid off with 180 more planes.
So again, just gives you a little idea, and obviously that's made by the British themselves, so a little bit heavy-handed on their side. But again, you're talking about very young men, 19, 18, 19, 20 years old, going up there and flying all around, including this pilot who's going to end up being shot down and killed a couple of days after this photo was taken, nor be able to go and do that. Again, famously, the British are going to try to get on with this. Again, you can see the temporary rules for the golf club here as the bombs are going. And then again, you can see they're still playing soccer matches, even though they have the air raid wardens kind of running to halt it if need be from any attack. So as that's going on, the United States, what's happening on there in the Western Hemisphere, they're slowly and cautiously moving away from neutrality. In September of 1939, when the war breaks out, the United States puts forth the cash and carry provision. If anybody wants to show up with cash to carry stuff away from the United States, they're more than willing to do that. But obviously, the United States is much more willing to do that with the Allies than any other places. In the summer of 1940, as Britain is being under attack from the the skies from Germany, and a lot of people in the British government are coming out and writing up terms of surrender, and only a very few people, particularly Winston Churchill, keeps that from happening. Uh, Churchill calls FDR, and Roosevelt promises Great Britain all aid short of war during this. It's in the September of 1940, on September 27th, that Japan, Germany, and Italy become the Axis powers. They do this by signing what's called the Tripartite Pact, and what they're doing here is try to keep the United States out of the war. This signing is aimed squarely at the chest of the Americans, and what it says, if the United States is going to declare war on one country, Japan in the east, then Germany and Italy will declare war on the United States, and then vice versa. The Germany and Italians are attacked by the Americans, Japan will do this. What the goal of the Axis powers to do, what's the goal of the creation, is force the United States to fight a two-ocean war, to fight simultaneously in the Pacific Ocean while also fighting the Atlantic Ocean, and that's obviously impossible. No nation in the world could be able to do that, and so that's what they're doing. Problem the United Kingdom and Britain runs into by the end of 1940, it has no more cash. So that cash and carry provision doesn't work anymore because they've run out of money. So the United States comes up with what's called the Lend-Lease Act. The United States will lend or lease arms to any nation whose defense the United States deems vital to themselves. With the German invasion of Russia in the summer of 1941, which we'll dive into in the next lecture, we'll show you a couple quick pictures later. The Soviet Union is also going to receive Lend-Lease aid, but this is not going to be liked by some in the USA because for a lot of people in America view the Soviet Union as just as bad. But again, it's the old adage of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and so that's kind of where that comes in. So with the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1940, the Germans begin to go and press on towards Moscow. They're able to gobble up lots of territory as they're moving through and taking out a whole bunch of things as they move to the vast expanses that is Western Russia, lighting their cigarettes on flamethrowers, wearing glasses, and then dressing up their dogs, right, in order to be able to go and shoot and kill people from there. Hitler also deploys his navy, just like in World War I. Germany deploys U-boats to attack Allied shipping. What differs in tactics between World War I and World War II, the German submarines, is that the U-boats in World War II are going to work together in what are called wolf packs. They're going to hunt Allied shipping in groups of several U-boats, just like how a wolf hunts with several other wolves in packs, and you're going to be able to attack in numbers and be able to take out the convoys that are traveling kind of against them. They're deployed from the Gulf of Mexico to the North Atlantic, and they start sinking up to over 350,000 tons of shipping a month, which is a lot. In June of 1941, Roosevelt grants the U.S. Navy permission for U.S. warships to shoot U-boats in self-defense. If you know in your timeline here, the United States American sailors and American boats shooting American guns at now Germany. And so this is pretty much war in name only from there. By mid 1943, though, the U-boat threat's been contained by a better use of convoy system, radar, anti-sub patrolling aircraft, the British breaking the Nazi Enigma code in order to be able to read their messages and be able to kind of work their way around from there. And so they're able to stop that. This is a map of all the ships sunk during World War II by submarines. And you can kind of see just how many there are, particularly around Great Britain and also along the coast of the United States. Google Earth has a pretty good application where you can go and look at it and see, and actually tell you, you can click on all those different dots on Google Earth and it'll tell you, is this ship carrying this much stuff when one was shot down and stuff. So you can kind of see with the help of the convoy system, particularly moving away from the United States while it's still early in the war, to again protecting stuff and forcing the U-boats in a small area where again it's kind of they help them mitigate the risk as the war goes on through better use of a convoy system and again hunting down the U-boats themselves. In August of 1941, a secret meeting takes place between Roosevelt and the President of the United States and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister for Britain, on the USS Augusta. Some people in both the American and British government don't even know this is happening, and it's from there that the uh, British and Americans unleashed the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter states is where both the British and the Americans declare their joint war aims. Why are they fighting World War II? Again, the United States hasn't actually declared war on anybody yet. They're fighting for collective security, the idea that everybody in the world is working together, they need to be secure, the ideas of disarmament, that you're going to try to limit the eventual future aggression by limiting the amount of arms and armies and stuff. The idea of self-determination, which we talked about in World War One, that ethnic groups and groups of people should be able to determine for themselves whether they want to remain a part of stuff. Again, that old democratic principle of voting, economic cooperation amongst people, and freedom of the seas. Roosevelt is also promises Churchill and the British at this that he's going to look for any sort of ways to force an incident to allow Congress to declare war, to be able to kind of push Americans towards fighting from this. The Atlantic Charter is important because it's the kind of be the, the document that allows for 26 nations to join the Allied powers in the war. So we have the tripartite pact on one side with the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. On the flip side, the opposing side is going to be Allied powers. We're pretty much going to sign the Atlantic Charter through the war as Roosevelt and Churchill here are on the USS Augusta meeting to be able to go and sign that pact. So that's where we're kind of leave the war in Europe, and we're going to kind of circle back to what's been happening in the Pacific. Hideki Tojo is the Japanese Army Chief of Staff, and by the mid 1930s, he's pretty much running the not only military aspect of Japan, but also the economy of Japan to help out the Japanese military. As we said, in July of 1937, Japan launches an invasion of China, attacks most of the major coastal cities, bombs Shanghai pretty bad, and eventually it's going to control an area the size of France in northeast China around Beijing, the capital. By July of 1941, a lot of the European nations are unable to defend their Asian possessions from falling into Japanese hands because of one, most of the armies are been captured and governments have been knocked out by the German advances in Western Europe, and the Japanese are using that to their advantage by taking over from there. The United States wants to help out their European allies, and so Roosevelt tells his government to freeze all Japanese funds and assets in the United States. What this meant, if you're a Japanese business owner, and say you've got money or you've got stuff in the United States is going to freeze it. They're basically not going to steal that money from you, but they're going to put it in a vault, lock the key, and say you can't touch it unless the government acts better to the United States. And that's what Roosevelt's initial plan is. But as this order works its way through the government, you can think of this like a game of telephone, is that the result of this one action is the United States stops all of its oil exports to Japan. So Japan effectively its war machine is cut off from oil to make gasoline and all the other products it needs. Japan can't function without any outside oil, can't function without this American oil. The economists and the logistics people in the Japanese army take a look at the situation here in July of 1941, and they respond and tell the military of Japan they only have 2 years worth of reserves left on regular footing, and there's only 18 months worth of oil under wartime conditions. Japan is in no condition of winning and defeating and capturing all of China in 18 months. So they're kind of in a very sticky situation. So Japan is kind of sitting here in July of 1941 with the option of one, solving this problem diplomatically, of going to the Americans and saying, "Hey, what do you need us to do? We need that oil. How can we stop?" And they knowing that if they go to the United States to diplomatic work out, they're going to have to give stuff up. They're going to have to stop the war in China, all this stuff. Or the Japanese can get oil for themselves by going to the Dutch East Indies and seizing the oil fields there. However, the caveat with that is if they do that, that will 100% lead to war with the United States. So Japan's kind of sitting there in July of 1941 trying to assess its options. At least that's what Hideki Tojo, right, the Japanese military leader there, is doing. As we left Japan in 1937, this is from 41, but you can see it's taken over Manchukuo. It's already taken over Korea in the early part of the century as a colony, and it's carved out an area around Beijing, around the coastal cities as it's beginning to move inland away from there as it's driving. They are committing lots of different atrocities to the Chinese people and the defenders as they're doing that. The Japanese there are taking a picture of these people being buried alive. And again, you can see what that guy's holding in his hand as they're chopping and working their way through there. Um, when the Japanese take the city of Nanjing during their conquest, there's the event called the Rape of Nanjing, where you can kind of fill in the blanks of what the Japanese did to the people, particularly the women of Nanjing, as they're doing that. As the Japanese are sitting down with the American government to come up with that, they set a December deadline for peace talks with the United States. If not by December, the Americans are going to leave the oil cut off relations. And so that's the kind of the counting clock the Japanese are dealing with. So in November of 1941, the Japanese decide that they're going to take the Dutch East India oil fields, so therefore they should have an attack on the United States. And so by November of 1941, while they are talking peace with the United States, the Japanese Navy begins to attack the United States as well. The United States knows this. They've broken the Japanese military code and the Japanese diplomatic code and most of the military code. So the Americans know that there's an attack happening, but the problem is they don't know where or when an attack will come, nor are they expecting Japan to do this. The war in the Pacific is against two different people, the United States and Japan, who both don't want to fight each other. The Japanese want to continue to expand in China. The United States wants to help out its allies and friends in Europe. So both of these armies don't want to fight each other, nor in 1941 are they equipped to fight in the Pacific kind of territories at all. So the United States is kind of sitting there and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do, and they're expecting an attack in the Philippines. That's the most likely course. It's the closest for the Japanese to attack, to be able to attack them there. So they prepare for that by sending their best general, Douglas MacArthur, is sent to the Philippines to shore up the islands owned by the United States for an attack from the Japanese. In 1940, the U.S. fleet moves to Hawaii at Pearl Harbor as a deterrent to the Japanese. But the commander of the U.S. fleet in Washington says this is the stupidest idea because all of the war plans the Americans have come up with for the 20th century all have the Pacific Fleet, no matter where an attack happens, go back to its home base in San Diego, California, anyways. And so he's saying there's no reason for the fleet to be at Pearl Harbor, and he is probably fired from his job, and they hire somebody who's going to say yes, and they move on. So that's MacArthur. He's pretty famous for his corncob pipe that he has from there. He's a pretty famous American. You'll learn more about him in U.S. history. He's the one who's attacked on there. The Japanese are going to roll the dice with the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese decide that they're going to gamble on a massive surprise attack to destroy the U.S. fleet in harbor, Pearl Harbor on Oahu, Hawaii, to be able to cripple the U.S.'s ability to carry the war in the Pacific. They're going to make one quick strike, destroy the American fleet, right? Then be able to use the 3, 4, 5 years that they're expecting the Americans to build up a replacement fleet, to be able to build a solid line of defense, and be able to negotiate with the Americans to leave them alone. That's the plan. The Japanese send their surprise attack on a long, winding course into the North Pacific, and then they sail and attack straight south towards Hawaii, and they do this totally unnoticed. They're traveling in strict radio silence, and they're also traveling in the wake of a major storm system to help kind of keep there. And they're traveling in along rarely used shipping routes and avoiding most of the heavily trafficked ones as well. The attack on Pearl Harbor by the United States is deemed very low. The head of the U.S. Armed Forces, George Marshall, for World War II, tells President Roosevelt that Pearl is the strongest fortress in the world in the moment in 1941, and Pearl Harbor has its own radar warning system in place. However, because an attack is deemed very low, it's only operating part time from 4 a.m. in the morning to 7 a.m. in the morning. On the day of the attack, December 7th, it actually shut down late because they weren't paying attention. And at 7:02, it detects the first wave of the Japanese planes 137 miles out. But the head operator is told that it's just bombers being expected to be on flight from San Diego who must have taken a different course. They shut it down and they go get a breakfast on a very nice Hawaiian Sunday morning. So this is what the Japanese are doing. The attack on Pearl Harbor is in conjunction with attacking in the Philippines and in the Dutch East Indies to seize the oil fields there. And so this is just one attack as they go through the North Pacific and then straight south towards Oahu that way. Again, the idea is to establish a defensive perimeter, to isolate China, win the war there, and then be able to recover from any onslaught the United States, right? But again, they're going to take a while because they're going to destroy all their ships from there. So on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, at 7:40 a.m., four groups of 181 Japanese fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and small midget submarines arrive and attack the U.S. fleet sitting at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are the most modern, highly trained, and deadly pilots in the world. They've been flying. This is the same group of pilots that's been attacking the Chinese since 1937, so for over 4 years at this point. And they're flying the best airplane in the world, the Mitsubishi Zero, at this point as well. And so they've got the technology, they've got the expertise, they've got the plans, and more importantly, they have the element of surprise. What do they find lined up for them? All of the major U.S. battleships lined up like ducks in a row at harbor. They find no U.S. fighter planes on alert. They find that any anti-aircraft guns the Army has set up to protect Pearl Harbor has no live ammunition on hand, meaning that there's not actual real bullets on there. It's just all practice ammunition for the practices they've been doing there. Basically, they catch the Americans totally and completely by surprise, with some sailors still asleep on their boats. After two waves of attack, the Japanese sail away with over six battleships of the United States sunk and sinking, two battleships, three destroyers, and three cruisers heavily damaged, 180 planes destroyed, most of those planes destroyed and damaged on the ground, and over 128 planes badly damaged. They leave 3,600 United States sailors and soldiers and pilots killed or wounded in their wake. And so it's a complete and total success. There's a third wave that was supposed to be launched, but the Japanese uh, admirals decide that this is already more than they could have possibly hoped for. This is already a big giant gamble. They don't want to risk anything, and they go and sail away. In their view, it's a complete success, except, and this is important, the Japanese do not destroy any of the U.S. aircraft carriers, nor did they destroy any of the huge oil reserves or the logistical facilities of the harbor, meaning that the Japanese don't catch the U.S. aircraft carriers, which were important in carrying out the Pacific War later on in World War II. They are just by coincidence off on training missions out in the Pacific, nor do they destroy the ability of the United States to refit their ships, refix them, and send them out later on. And so those important things that the third wave would definitely have been able to do kind of makes this a somewhat salvageable event for the Americans. So this is Pearl Harbor, particularly as we're there. And again, this is what the Japanese find from there. What's called Battleship Row of all the major U.S. battleships in the Pacific, all lined up from there, and then smaller ships and cruisers and destroyers all around the Naval Air Station. The Japanese have been working on this plan for a long time. They made a scale model of Pearl Harbor to be able to provide their soldiers and pilots exactly kind of what they would expect to find from there. And those are the pilots giving their final briefings and final missions. And this is a picture from a Japanese plane, and this is what they see over Pearl Harbor when they begin their attack. Again, all the battleships lined up nice, neatly in a row for them to go there, and they pretty much rain terror and hellfire down upon the Americans. Or again from there, they're going and blowing up ships left and right. They're blowing up planes. They're still on the ground, and a couple of the major battleships are exploded and blown up as well. The famous USS Arizona was hit with a direct hit. It's kind of its magazine where all of its kind of bullets and bombs are stored. It was said the force of the explosion was so big that it lifted this big, huge, giant boat out of the ground and then, sorry, out of the water and then smashed it back down in there, trapping several hundred sailors who weren't immediately killed underneath the water line to slowly drown over the course of a week or so from there. And that's where the USS Arizona Memorial's in Pearl Harbor today, which you can go and visit. When the Japanese leave, this is what they leave in their wake of the fire and the smoke. And again, all these ships, some of these ships have settled down again into the shallower waters up there, but you can see from the air all the oil and stuff still linking off from there. And they're pretty much hunks of twisted metal and steel. But again, because they didn't destroy the ability for the Americans to tow these hulks into this, they could shortly be salvaged or in some cases actually put back together. In Washington, D.C., when they heard about this, the mood ranges from outrage to panic. The next day, December 8th, President Roosevelt famously in a speech says that December 7th, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, uh, he asks for and receives from Congress a declaration of war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy will declare war on the United States to back up their agreement of the tripartite pact. And in hindsight, sitting from our heights here in 2020, this is dumb. This is ridiculously stupid in retrospect for both of them. It's going to lead to both Hitler and Mussolini dying because of this decision. And again, really, the United States hasn't done a whole lot to them. But again, they're fulfilling that from there. Many of the isolationists that were in America now are supporting an all-out American war effort to get revenge for Pearl Harbor. We see a massive wave of volunteers for all the armed forces. And as we said, the attack on Pearl Harbor is just one of a big, giant operation by the Japanese in conjunction. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, they also attack Wake Island and Guam a few hours after Pearl. Japan's now cut off the communications line in the Central Pacific from the United States to the Philippines. The Philippine Islands are now isolated, as you probably expect. That's where they're going to attack the United States um, next. And where we're going to pause in our story of World War II for a second. We're going to pause at December of 1941. Winston Churchill is going to take a trip over to the United States, and he's going to spend the final 3 weeks of 1941 with the White House, sitting down with Roosevelt and the American Army Chiefs of Staff, and he's able to convince the Americans that the next best thing for them to do is attack North Africa, and that's where we'll leave this story here. So on December 8th, Roosevelt, in this picture, steps before Congress and asks for and then receives the Declaration of War against Japan. And then this is him flicking on the White House Christmas tree lights for the Christmas tree there. And you can see off to his right Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, as he's convincing the Americans that the next thing they should do is attack North Africa. And that's when we'll pick up the story when we circle back to World War II and our next time.